Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is Dr. Carolyn Shivers speaking, and it is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nestor Matthews. Dr. Matthews is a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and data analytics at Denison University. So we have my home state of Ohio well represented between Hiram College from yesterday's keynote speaker and now Denison with Dr. Matthews. And Dr. Matthews joined the faculty at Denison in 2001 after completing his postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Neurobiology and Behavior at Columbia. He teaches numerous classes on sensation and perception, statistics, research methods, and has provided seminars including the cognitive neuroscience of music, ruining humor with science, and Nerds Without Borders. And I would really love to hear more about that class. He has done incredible work integrating disability into his teaching and gave a presentation related to today's topic at a conference earlier this year that Dr. Bogart happened to attend. And she immediately came back to me and said, we have to get this guy. This is absolutely perfect for our conference. So we know you're going to learn a lot. So take it away, Dr. Matthews.
Dr. Shivers, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to try to share my slides first. We'll see if that works. Let me dial up. Okay, I think we're there. I wonder if I can get a thumbs up from someone indicating that they can see my slides. Okay, looks like people are saying that they can see those. So thank you very much. I do want to, again, thank Dr. Shivers and Dr. Bogart for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Also want to thank Dr. Olkin for the prior presentation. I learned so much. And one of the things that I think is really, really neat is that I am not a clinician, unlike Dr. Olkin, who shared her wide experience as a clinician, and also she's in a graduate program. I'm at Denison University, which is a small liberal arts college in the middle of Ohio. I have undergraduates only. So let me describe myself. I think that's what we're doing in this conference. It seems very appropriate. I'm a man. I'm about 5'6" tall. I have dark hair. I'm wearing reading glasses. And I'm sitting in my office at Denison University on the 4th floor of my building. Behind me are some of the things in my office. I've got an exercise ball. I have some light weights that I use when I need to take a little break. I have my guitar that I don't play well, but I enjoy playing, and that's behind me. Those are some of the things that you may or may not be able to see as you're watching today. So I'm delighted to be sharing this with you today, and some of you might be able to see that I've got a QR code. All of my slides are available to you at this Open Science Framework website. You're welcome to go there anytime. In addition to these slides, I have a few other resources that I found helpful when I was teaching my courses. I will continue to use those resources. They are available to you if you have any interest. Again, all of that is accessible at this QR code and also at this website that you see right before you. So we'll move on in just a moment, but I'll let people get to that website if they're so inclined. Okay, so raising disability awareness through the teaching of sensation and perception. Okay, so I've done this version of this talk in a live audience. We'll ask you to put it into the chat the word yes if you teach or have taught a course on sensation and perception, maybe an entire course, as I do, on sensation and perception. Okay, you see a few people chiming in on the chat. Let me go to a variant that I think is more likely to engender some responses here, and that is that, oops, there we go. Now we're sliding on down. Can you raise your hand or instead put into the chat a yes if you teach or have taught a sensation and perception unit inside of intro psych? Okay, I think I see a few more responses going on there. So you can imagine that teaching sensation and perception could take the form of its entire course, a standalone course, or it could take the form instead of a little section, maybe 1 week's worth in a 14-week course or a 10-week course that you might have for intro psych. And that's the way that many of us come to that. So what I hope to offer you today is if you're in either of those categories, or if you'd like to introduce the connection between sensation and perception and disability in any other way in any of your courses, I hope that this might offer something to you. So here's an outline of where we're going. First, planning and contextualizing the course or the unit within intro psychology. And this is important, I think, because when I myself was beginning on this route about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, teaching sensation and perception with a disability component, there was quite a bit of pushback in my own department. It seemed unusual to the folks in, I think, traditionally trained, I think it seems unusual to traditionally trained psychology instructors that disability would be in with sensation and perception. So I had to do some advocating for it and some contextualizing that I'll share with you. Also, I'll offer some in-class starters for introducing students to the connection between sensation and perception and disability. Then a little later on, we'll talk about some student essays as a type of assignment that you might be able to use or to modify when we're talking about sensation and perception and disability. Then I'll conclude with unbewusster Schluss, the unconscious inference. The phrase unbewusster Schluss is a phrase from Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a German founder of early psychology and also sensation and perception. And he actually has some important insights, I think, for the connection between disability and sensation and perception. So we'll look forward to jumping in and talking a little bit about planning and contextualizing the course. So I hope some of the bright colors here will catch your attention if you're starting to fade into the afternoon, as is understandably the case. We'll talk about planning and contextualizing the course or the unit. So let's start with a very, very big picture to help us set the stage for sensation and perception. And we'll talk about this at a few different levels. One level will be a level at which we might have the Association for Psychological Science. They give us some goals for the psychology major. And they also give us some integrative themes. But I'd like to begin by talking about some of the goals that I think align particularly well with our endeavor this afternoon of trying to connect sensation and perception to disability. So here you can see some of the colored letters that describe the different goals that I think align best. So the first one is goal 3.2 from the APA goals for the psychology major. And this is to develop and practice interpersonal and cultural responsiveness. And intercultural responsiveness here I've underlined because there is an important sense in which disabilities can have their own culture. 3.3 applies psychological principles to strengthen the community. We think very deeply here at Denison about how our 18 to 22-year-olds are going to go off to any number of communities throughout their long careers, and their capacity to build that community will in part depend on their awareness of disability. And sensation and perception is one place where we can cultivate that skill. Interacting effectively with others and displaying effective judgment in professional interactions are other goals that I think align well with bringing sensation and perception together with disability. So these are some of the APA goals that rather directly address what we're trying to do here in this synthesis. There are also, as I've mentioned, these integrative themes. So here are some of the themes that I think align best, particularly in green. So psychological science values diversity, promotes equity, and fosters inclusion in the pursuit of a more just society. This again is coming to us from the APA's recommendations for the psychology major. Also, our perceptions and biases filter our experiences of the world through an imperfect lens. And as I wrap up today, when we get to section 4, and we're talking about unbewusster Schluss, we'll talk about our biases and some of the lenses that influence our perception and our attitudes toward persons with disability. And we're not always aware of these. Sometimes they are explicit, and sometimes they are implicit. And I was delighted that Dr. Olkin spoke earlier about the lack of correlation between implicit attitudes and explicit attitudes. And finally, at the bottom, we have psychological, biological, social, and cultural factors influence behavior and mental processes. And this is important for setting up the biopsychosocial model that, again, Dr. Olkin mentioned before, and I'll elaborate on shortly. But in case you're trying to contextualize any of this for people who might be on your boards for determining what courses count toward the psychology major, I'm hopeful that some of these APA themes and goals might give you a boost along those lines. Okay. So one possibility too is when we move away from the APA, we move towards something a little bit more local for you. Almost all institutions of higher education have a mission statement, and it seems likely that you'll be able to connect our work here on disability to your mission statement. It might be that your department has such a statement about valuing diversity, and they might even include explicitly a reference to diversity. You might also be at an institution like I am that has a general education requirement. This is often the case at undergraduate schools, and the general education requirements often include such things as a quantitative reasoning component, a writing component, a speaking component. About 15 years ago now, our institution included a power and justice component, and that's how I was able to make some connection to my synthesis of psychology's sensation and perception with disability. Okay? So you might call your general education requirement by a slightly different name. Here at Denison, we call it power and justice. It might be called a social justice component. It might be a DEI aspect of your general education requirement. If you are at an institution that has this kind of general education requirement, you might know that sometimes the institution is having some difficulty in staffing those courses. They're always looking for teachers to cover something that might address diversity. And this would be another argument for you to synthesize sensation and perception with disability and contribute to your general education staffing by picking up this capacity to cover a power and justice course. Your institution might also have a tradition of shared readings. That is, whenever there's a new incoming class, sometimes to help orient the class and to give everybody a common basis for aligning with one another, there's a shared reading. At Denison, we often point to a reading by William Cronin. This is called Only Connect, The Goals of a Liberal Education. And here we go out of our way to find connections between seemingly unrelated topics. And that was certainly the case when I began teaching this course in the way that I teach it now. As I mentioned, I was getting some pushback from people who thought, well, sensation and perception is a pretty distinct area of psychology. What does that have to do with disability? They didn't see the connection. But with a shared institutional reading like this, I had a mechanism by which I could get some institutional legitimacy for trying to make this connection. There are also course level themes. So we started out at the APA level. We went down to a level that might be specific to your own institution. For you, as a course instructor, I think that you can tie into any number of course themes, one of which Dr. Olkin alluded to slightly a few minutes ago. She was speaking of the biopsychosocial model of psychology, and this really aligns very well with sensation and perception and synthesizing disability. In particular, many of us think of sensation and perception as originating pretty much on the biological end of the psychology intro spectrum. So frequently after we have a little bit of background and introduction to psychology on what psychology is, what is its scope, how is it methodologically coherent, how is it topically coherent, we often begin with biological psychology. Then shortly after that, usually sensation is next in line. It's a very common sequence. So it's not difficult to make a connection to biological psychology. What's really nice is when we start talking about sensation and perception and disability, we have a really direct connection to the social world. And so this can be an effective model. I use it in all of my courses. I certainly use it in the units where I'm teaching sensation and perception with disability. So that helps the students organize some information content-wise. We also want them to develop metacognitive skills. And many of us use Bloom's taxonomy. Here, I very gratefully acknowledge this particular layout of Bloom's taxonomy. Many of us are familiar with this. This one comes to us from Vanderbilt University. And we emphasize to our students that in putting together disability with sensation and perception, we're asking them to apply what they're learning to some real life challenges. And we're going to ask them in this course to create some essays that force them to do some integration. It's not just about the lowest levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So between having the biopsychosocial model where they can hang their content that they get in the course, and this diagram that helps them organize their metacognition. These are some course level themes that might be of assistance to you if you're thinking about bringing disability into any of your courses, in particular sensation and perception. So to summarize what we've got so far, we've talked about that APA does offer some guidelines and goals and sub-goals for the psychology major, and they offer some integrative themes. Your university or your department might have some themes of their own. There might be a university mission statement. There might be a general education requirement that has social justice or intersectionality of some variety, and you can make a connection that way. There might be shared readings. Then there are also course level themes that you might have more control over as an instructor, and you could use something like the biopsychosocial model or Bloom's taxonomy. So this is one of the things to think about as you are maybe augmenting or modifying an existing unit or developing a new course that brings disability together with other aspects of psychology. In my particular case, it's sensation and perception. Okay, another bright red slide. Tell us that we're at part 2 here. And this is my opportunity to share with you some things I've used in class. And I am hopeful that there are some elements from this that might benefit you if you're thinking about bringing disability in your class. I also want to say a second time, and probably a third and fourth time, that I'll be acknowledging many of the sources that I'm using here. I've tried to be as eclectic as I could, and some of these things that I borrowed from other readings have really worked well for me in the classroom. So I often begin my psychology course that has a section on sensation and perception with this item from Kurt Koffka. Some of us will recognize Kurt Koffka as a very famous psychologist in the history of psychology, very big in the world of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology, of course, is germane to sensation and perception. But I just love the simplicity of his question. Why do things look as they do? Very, very simple question. And he offers 2 simple answers to this simple question. Things look as they do because the brain is as it is. That's one answer that we have. His second answer is that things look as they do because the world is as it is. So you can see from this simple question, we're setting ourselves up to have something like an internal response to the question and also an externally focused response to the question. So with that, this could work in any sensation and perception course, okay? What I do after I start with this is I try to now begin to bend it a little bit toward disability using some of the following information. As I've mentioned, we can say that Kurt Koffka acknowledges that the brain and more generally the nervous system is playing a role in our sensations and perceptions. Kurt Koffka probably meant the external world when he was talking about the world being as it is, as an answer to the question of why things look as they do. He probably meant the external world, and he probably meant the physical world more particularly. Perfectly reasonable way to go, and in a standard sensation and perception course, that's what we would typically do. We'd be looking at the physical world, we'd be looking at light, which we call electromagnetic energy. We'd be looking at sound, which we call acoustic energy, okay? That's the physical world. Now, a critical distinction that we might make for students, and here's my bright green slide of my sensation and perception talk, to partly grab your attention, but partly also to make sure that you're very aware of this distinction. It's not uncommon in an S&P course to talk about the perceptual consequences of blindness or deafness, or maybe a type of blindness like color blindness, something along those lines. And what we want to do in our variation of a sensation and perception course is talk about the social consequences of blindness or deafness so that the students can see both of these things, okay? Now, as educators, it might be, and particularly as people who teach psychology courses, we're probably very aware of this first one. Our students might be less aware of this kind of distinction. So a typical S&P course would be emphasizing the perceptual consequences of blindness. And I do that in my units on S&P and in my course in S&P. Here, what I hope is new is this disability focus on S&P. And what I think is most interesting about this is to make this distinction early and often. That is, that students might easily get drawn to the perceptual consequences, and they might begin to imagine what it's like to be deaf or to be colorblind and so forth. What we need to make very clear to them is that there are also important social consequences. Now, you and I as instructors and people who are interested in disability are already aware of this, I often encourage us to be aware of the curse of knowledge, that just because we understand that there are important social consequences for this, that might not be evident to our 18 to 22-year-old students who are new to the science of psychology. They might be taking this course as a general education course. So I try to remind myself that I've got to make a few things explicit here, including the social consequences of these kinds of sensory disabilities. And here we can harken back again to Kafka's answers. We have one answer that's very brain focused, right? Very nervous system focused, the perceptual consequences of blindness. But when we're getting to the external component, we're talking about the world. We now are introducing the social component. And again, we want to make this really clear to students. So what might this look like on a first day of class in the S&P course, or maybe the first day of your section on sensation and perception, if you're teaching a sensation and perception component of intro psych? Here's an exercise that I've done, and I think I saw something similar in Dr. Olkin's presentation just a little while ago. What I do is I have students write down a list of all illnesses, injuries, disabilities, or other health issues, and that could include mental health issues that they've ever had. So they're just taking a few minutes and writing. Then they have them circle the most severe and the least severe based on their lived experience. So which of those do they find most severe, least severe? By the way, I also asked the students to give each other a little bit of privacy here. At Denison, we're a small college, we have small classrooms. It's fairly easy for the students to see what one another will be writing. This can be a sensitive issue, so we do encourage students to have some space between them so they can really focus on writing these items down and circling what's most severe and least severe. Then I asked them to reflect on the multiple factors that made the circled items more or less severe. Okay, so they're going to circle a couple from their main list. And then I invite the students, after they've done that, to share with me, to share out loud, not the health issues, but the factors that made their lived experience, for example, relatively difficult for their more severe disabilities. And I'm listing those on the board as we're going along. And then I have the students comment or try to classify those as best they can. And this is, I think, helpful in a couple of ways. This exercise has students realize that they too have been disabled in the past. And that's important. They don't always see that. And they will again be disabled in the future. It's one of the interesting things about this category of difference is that we move in and out of it in a way that might not be true of other important kinds of difference. It makes people with disabilities part of their in-group, right? And it gets students thinking about different kinds of factors that contribute to disability. So a lot goes on in that relatively simple exercise. And again, it can work in lots of different contexts. It can be a full-blown course on sensation or perception, and it can also be a simple unit within intro psych. Okay, something else that I've had students do, I have them take a look at different kinds of surveys. And Dr. Olkin spoke before about differences between the moral model and the medical model and the social model. And many of us are familiar with those, but remembering the curse of knowledge, we know about those models, trying to convey to a young audience what those models are, I think is pretty effectively done through this exercise. So I have students assume that they are deaf and are asked this 1986 survey about their deafness. So they're going to be answering some survey questions that come back to them from 1986. And as you can see up here in the upper right-hand corner, these questions come from the medical model. So these really were questions from the survey. I didn't make these up. I'll read them to you. Question number 1. Can you tell me what's wrong with you? Question number 2. Are your difficulties in understanding people mainly due to a hearing problem? Remember that I've told them that they're deaf for this exercise. Does your health problem or disability make you rely on relatives for care? Number 4, does your health problem or disability prevent you from going out as often as you would like? Number 5, does your health problem or disability affect your work? Okay, so you might detect, if you're familiar with the medical model, how this has a bent to it. It has a very medical model bent. Now what we do is we have students answer a very similar set of questions right after they do this one. but it has a very different kind of focus. This might be the social model. Okay? And the social model takes those questions and reframes them this way. Can you tell me what's wrong with society? Remember that the earlier counterpart was, can you tell me what's wrong with you? Number two, are your difficulties in understanding people mainly due to their inability to communicate with you? Number three, are community services so poor that you must rely on relatives for care? Number four, are there transportation problems that prevent you from going out as often as you would like? Notice here that the focus, the emphasis is on the transportation problems. And number five, do you have problems at work because of the physical environment or attitudes of others? And this harkens back to our question that we opened with when we talked about why do things look as they do. We have answers that include because the brain is as it is, because the world as it is. The world includes the social world and social attitudes. Okay, so this is basically the same set of 5 questions, but tweaked in a way that's consistent with the social model. And it gets the students to see that you could be raised in an environment that has explicitly or implicitly adopted kind of a social model lens or a medical model lens. Another nice contribution of this particular exercise, it's an opportunity to make a connection. And at Denison, we try to make connections all the time. Make a connection to Roeder's locus of control from intro psych. And it might be that if you were teaching this in intro psych, you've already spoken about Roeder's locus of control, and you can harken back to that. Or it might be that Roeder's locus of control has not yet come up, and you can use this as an opportunity to plant a seed about whether the focus is on the individual or on the society. Where's the limitation coming from? And this is a really nice contrast between these two models. I think the students get a good appreciation for this. Okay, I also like to give a shout out to a book that I use and I find very helpful. This is a book by Dr. Dana Dunn. It's called The Social Psychology of Disability. And early on in my course, I rely pretty heavily on chapter 1, The Social Psychology of Disability. And here, there's an emphasis on Kurt Lewin's person-environment relationship. And we can see that contrast in the social model versus the medical model that we just described. There's also the student's introduction to person-first language, which Dr. Dunn describes as an antidote to essentialism. And Dr. Dunn is actually very nuanced about this. He acknowledges that not everybody appreciates person-first language. It doesn't always work, but it's something to think about, and it gives our students an opportunity to conceptualize that by speaking of, for example, disabled persons, we are foregrounding the disability rather than their personhood. And many of our 18 to 22-year-olds have not thought about that idea. So this is a nice introduction to that topic. There's a second Dana. This is Dr. Dana Susskind, and she is a cochlear implant surgeon. She's done some important work on the topic of deafness. And as a surgeon, she had a very interesting experience. She was describing that at one point in her career, she had 2 young children, I think about a year old, in whom she put a cochlear implant. And it turned out that both of these young children had very, very successful medical surgeries. Medically, everything was fine. Then about a year later, she checked in with the kids again, and one of the kids was really flourishing, and language acquisition was coming along just beautifully. The other child was really struggling with language acquisition. And as a surgeon, this was a puzzle to Dr. Susskind. She began to wonder, well, how could these 2 kids have medically identical outcomes and yet cognitively be in such different places as little as 1 year later? And she started an entire movement and a program that's funded by the National Science Foundation, where we look at the environment, we look at the social environment where the child is raised, and she saw tremendous differences between these 2 children in their social environments, and in particular, their exposure to language. And she came up with the 3 T's that some of you might be familiar with. That is, it's important for young children as they're acquiring language, and maybe especially for children who have cochlear implants, an important topic in sensation and perception, to tune in, talk more, and take turns. So by tuning in, we have shared attention between the adult and the child. Talking more, just having a lot of language, can be very helpful. And importantly, turn taking, right, which builds on the shared attention. And there's a nice article in Psychological Science from Harvard University that talks about those 3 T's, describes the importance of each of them, and actually comes out on the conclusion that taking turns might be most important for how a young child develops language. Okay, so a nice follow-up from the surgical work that had been done by Dr. Susskind. A couple of other sources that might be of interest to you. Sound and Fury is a wonderful documentary that's probably about 20 years old or so now, about a young girl named Heather Artinian who was deaf, and she had members of her family that were deaf and members of her family that were hearing. And the family had quite a bit of a feud trying to understand or come to a conclusion about whether young Heather could be implanted or not with a cochlear implant. Um, Difficult to watch at some points because the arguing is very, very intense, but a great exposure for our students. At the other end of life spectrum, when we go to people toward the end of their life, we come to another video called Here and Now. And this is a charming story about a 65-year-old couple that have been deaf all their life. And they decide at age 65 that they want to get a cochlear implant. And it's really interesting. One member of the pair has a lot of success with the cochlear implant. The other encounters a lot of frustration. So again, a really important window into the lived experience of people with deafness and people who are trying to experiment with cochlear implants. So the students have enjoyed these resources. A couple of other resources to point out to you. Some wonderful writings by the neurologist Oliver Sacks. Some of these books might be familiar to you. The Island of the Colorblind speaks of an island in the South Pacific. It is the island of Pingalap, and the people are Pingalapese, have a relatively high prevalence of a quite severe form of color blindness, and how that confers some advantages in that society and some other disadvantages in that society. So a very interesting read there. And Oliver Sacks, as many of you know, also was very fond of music, and he has Musicophilia, Tales of the Music and the Brain. And here we can talk about having changes in the cochlea over time that allow us to actually distort the way that we hear music. And he has a very nice chapter also on Williams syndrome, which is these young children who have rather exceptional musical abilities and other hearing abilities, which works well in sensation and perception, despite some other relatively pronounced cognitive deficits. So these readings have also gone well with our students. Okay, so to summarize part two, remember back in part one, we said, how do we motivate this and develop the course and try to contextualize it, given other curricular considerations in our at our institution or at our department. In part two, we're summarizing some of the things we can do as starters. We can have Kurt Kafka's framing question, why do things look as they do? We can talk about the perceptual versus the social consequences of blindness or deafness or some other sensory disability. We can have the students list their disabilities and have them contrast the social model with the medical model. And then in weeks 2 and 3, we have student-generated discussions on some of the items that I mentioned, the readings from Oliver Sacks, or some of the articles from Dr. Susskind or from Harvard, videos including Sound and Fury, and also Here and Now. Lots of things that you can do in the classroom or have students watch those out of the classroom and have a discussion in the classroom. Those have been well received by students, and they make the merger well between sensation and perception and disability. Okay, now we're up to part 3, and that means another bright slide to keep you with us. So in my sensation and perception course, what I often do is I've tried to get away from just having multiple choice questions as tests and fill in the blank and short answers. And I have students write essays that give them the opportunity to really integrate and move way up on Bloom's taxonomy as they connect sensation and perception to disability. So here's a typical kind of assignment that we might do. We might have them write a 1,000-word essay that makes an argument while integrating course concepts with 3 different sources that I, as the instructor, assign to them. And here we've got a book chapter, so maybe one of the chapters from Social Psychology of Disability. We might have a video for them to look at, maybe a TED Talk, and I'll give you an example of one of those in just a moment. And I'll also give you an example of a primary research article. And I was delighted to see that it's from some of the authors that Dr. Olkin cited just a little while ago. So they've got these 3 sources. By the way, the 3 sources by design are written for very different kinds of audiences. So the book chapter is written for undergraduates, particularly in psychology. The video is for a more general audience, maybe a TED Talk that doesn't presuppose any knowledge of psychology. And the primary research article is basically written by PhDs for PhDs, but we do like to introduce our students to primary sources. particularly when we get a nice connection between disability and sensation and perception, as we will in the article that I'll share with you shortly. Okay, so let's see if we can get some feedback on how this works just structurally in the classroom. So what I have is the students will get that prompt. I'll show you the prompt in a moment that encourages them to write the 1,000-word essay. They'll submit their essay on the evening before class on our learning management system. You might have a learning management system like Canvas or Notebowl or Blackboard or Moogle. So I have them submit that the night before. And then during the first half of the class, students, in lieu of a test, they provide feedback to each other in the form of a writing workshop. So they're providing feedback on the originality of the students' ideas, on their capacity to merge these ideas across the different sources that they were given. They're even given feedback from student to student on their writing style. So we value all those things at Denison, probably too at your institution. You have a writing program, and this makes a nice connection with that. During the second half of the class, students discuss their essays. So this is really nice because here they otherwise would have been coming in and using this day for answering multiple choice questions, answering short response questions where they might write a sentence or two, or they're drawing graphs. Here they're having a discussion about the essays that they've drawn. And what's nice is now everybody's got something to say because they've all written 1,000 words. So they're relatively prepared to embark on this discussion. Here's the prompt. Okay. And in this particular case, I asked them to try to put together some of these resources. You can see chapter 4 from the Social Psychology of Disability. This is about attitudes towards people with disabilities, and these can be either explicit attitudes or implicit attitudes. The TED Talk that I have them watch, and they really enjoy this. I highly recommend this one. Fun TED Talk called I Listen to Color, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, by Neil Harbison. And then a 2022 article from Psychological Science, The Pattern of Implicit and Explicit Attitudes, Change and Stability Over the Past 13 Years. And this again is from Charlesworth and Banaji. So what they're doing is they're writing an essay based on those three sources. They're going to write 1,000 words. Their essay has to take the form of thesis, a lot of time on the demonstration, and then a conclusion. And while they're doing their readings on chapter 4, they're encountering these kinds of ideas. They're learning about the difference between explicit versus implicit attitudes. We usually cover that in intro psych. Maybe not everybody does in intro psych, but typically at Denison, students are already familiar with that concept. We talk about the contact hypothesis from Gordon Allport, this notion that exposing people to others of difference is a mechanism for reducing prejudice. Okay, so a really nice opportunity to think about, in a practical sense, what could we do to make some progress on the social experiences of people with disabilities, the contact hypothesis, something they read about there. And here again is a diagram showing this is Neil Harbison, and he's the fellow who is colorblind. He has a retinal difference such that, unlike most of us, he does not see chromatic color, but he lives in a grayscale world as he describes it. The device that you see on his head is actually surgically implanted. And what this device does is, toward the front, near his forehead, it sends out a beam of light. And the beam of light bounces back. And as it bounces back, this sensor can tell what colors are out in the environment. And different colors vibrate his skull in different ways that he can actually hear. So there's a conversion from light to sound. And so he has the essential experience of hearing color, and he's gotten to be quite good at it. He's actually gotten to be almost as good as you and I at distinguishing colors, even though he never sees them, he only hears them. He's also extended this mechanism in a way that allows him into the infrared range, which you and I cannot see, and he's extended it on the other end of the spectrum into the ultraviolet range. So he's gone from neural remediation to neural enhancement by having this particular device. He also talks about some of the challenges that he has with this device. For example, he's in the UK, and in the United Kingdom, prior to his experience, you were not allowed to have anything on your head when you were having your photograph taken for your driver's license. He was able to make the argument that this is a necessary part of his body, and he was now allowed to have his driver's license photograph show this particular device. So it's an interesting social interaction that he's having because of his sensory difference. All right, some time now on explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes. This is the article that the students would have been reading about. And I'll begin by sharing with you just a subset of some of the complicated slides that the students were grappling with on this assignment. So in this particular case, we're going to start out with explicit attitudes. And over here, we have explicit preference, okay? And what we can talk about is explicit preferences with respect to, in this case, sexuality. And in the diagram that I'm going to develop here, people are asked to give their explicit attitude toward people who are of same-sex orientation. Okay, now let's go on and bring ahead some data. And the way this graph is organized, such that if there were no difference in attitudes that people had toward same-sex others versus or people with a same-sex orientation, excuse me, versus an opposite sex orientation, then all of the data that you see here would fall right along this bottom horizontal line. To the extent that we get elevation off of that bottom horizontal line, we have some negative explicit attitude toward people who have a same-sex orientation. The good news here is there's a trend toward neutrality. Again, neutrality happens at this horizontal line at the bottom. That would be the 0 mark. And the projection would be over the next couple of years, based on the trend, that we might actually reach neutrality on explicit attitudes toward people who have a same-sex orientation. And that would be good news. That would be social progress. Now what I'm going to do is take this graph and shrink it down into one of 6 graphs. This will appear now on the lower upper left-hand side. So you see up here, the upper left-hand side, I've got that same graph, and we can play the same game now with just different kinds of variables, other kinds of difference. We can now track explicit preferences on race, and in this particular case, it was a comparison of Black versus white persons. So here we have explicit preference, and you can see that there's a trend on the explicit attitudes toward neutrality, which is good news. Skin tone, darker versus light tone, again, a trend toward neutrality. Interestingly, age remains relatively stable. There hasn't been that much change, and we still have an enduring negative attitude toward people who are quite a bit older. Disability was making some progress, which is nice to see. It's not down at neutrality yet, but making some progress for disability, and some progress also toward the issue of body weight. Here, this would be an indication that we have some improvement, but still a way to go on how people who are obese are perceived and the attitudes toward obesity. Okay, now these again, over on the right-hand side, are all about explicit attitudes. And to drive the point home earlier, the point that was made earlier by Dr. Olkin, there is a difference between explicit and implicit attitudes. So the next graph has exactly these same 6 in the same order: sexuality, race, skin tone, age, disability, and body weight, but now looking at implicit attitudes instead. Before I move the slide, I want to call your attention to an interesting difference. Note that disability is making some progress toward neutrality. There's a slight downward slope. The overall trend is not as negative here in the explicit attitude as it would be for body weight. That's kind of interesting. Right? Now, when we flip to implicit attitudes, that pattern more or less reverses. That is, we see basically no improvement whatsoever in implicit attitudes over these years towards people with disabilities. And overall, we have the highest level of negativity toward people with disabilities on these implicit attitudes. Interestingly, across the last several years, there's actually been a less favorable change, that is a worsening of attitudes towards people who are obese. We see over on this side. But for our purposes today, we're calling our students' attention to this particular line. And we're noting that although there might have been some progress on explicit attitudes, there was not progress on implicit attitudes. Okay? Here again is another conceptualization, another visualization, I should say, of these implicit attitudes. And it goes from 2014 in this case through 2020. And here, the items that we're looking at are sexuality. That would be a trend that's approaching neutrality for same-sex orientation. Skin tone is kind of leveling off. Age, body weight, and disability. Once again, you can see that we have the least favorable ratings, that's highest on this scale for disability relative to the other 6 that were shown in figure 1 of this 2022 paper. Something else I'll call your attention to that the authors wanted to point out, you might notice that there are some shaded areas here. The areas that are shaded for a particular color, so there's maybe a light gray, almost a light green color here, and where you see a little bit of a significant uptick, which is a worsening of implicit attitudes, we get a shaded area. Similarly, we have an uptick in implicit attitudes towards the darker skin tone. We lost ground there as these are going up. Right? And for our purposes in today's conversation, we see a relatively large increase in the implicit attitudes that are unfavorable towards people with disabilities. And that's a concern for us. Okay, so to summarize, in part 3, we've been talking about a specific kind of assessment that we might give. We might choose to give students not a multiple choice question or a short answer question. We might have them do some essays. And the essays can be of different formats, but in our format, we had it be an argumentative essay, it had to be integrative, and students were asked to integrate a book chapter from the Social Psychology of Disability with a video, it was Neil Harbison in this case, with a primary research article where they were grappling with differences in trends or different kind of demographic factors like race and sexual orientation and disability and age and so forth. And we had them grapple to look at the difference between implicit attitude trends versus explicit attitude trends, and to note that there really is a difference between those two. They're not the same thing. And they did an in-class writing workshop, and they had a discussion. Okay, so now we're off to part 4, and here's where we're moving into our end, and we'll wrap up with this idea that comes to us from Hermann von Helmholtz back in 1867, more than 150 years ago. His expression in German was unbewusster Schluss, which is fun to say. I have my students say that with me, unbewusster Schluss. Okay? And this means the unconscious inference. Now, many of us are able to get to his notion of the unconscious inference in sensation and perception when we do blind spot demos. Many of us in Psych 100 will teach about the blind spot. We might have our students cover one eye, and they'll look with their right eye at the letter R, and the L will disappear into their blind spot. It lands on the optic disc on the back of their eye. And they can switch eyes and look at the L with their left eye, and the R will disappear into the optic disc. So there's this physical optic disc. It contains no photoreceptors, but somehow, despite the fact that there's no bottom-up information for the eye to register, the brain fills things in. This is an important concept in sensation and perception. It's also a very important metaphor that was beautifully seen in this book called Blind Spot, The Hidden Biases of Good People. And I use this in my course. Here's a picture of Dr. Banaji. She and Dr. Greenwald speak about the top-down influences on social attitudes. And this is Blind Spot, The Hidden Biases of Good People. And a really nice metaphor that they pick up on from the world of sensation and perception over to the world of disability. So it's an unbewusster Schluss, and they the authors directly give Hermann von Helmholtz credit for this insight. So they come to this 3-part conceptualization, which is a nice way to think about both sensation and perception, but also disability awareness. So back in sensation and perception, we can say that the eye receives, the brain registers, and the mind interprets. And that becomes very obvious when we think about even the simple blind spot demo that we often do in intro psych. So the eye receives, and the eye has these photoreceptors in just about every spot of the retina except on the optic disc. The brain registers whatever the photoreceptors send it, but the mind then interprets and fills things in. Many of our students don't know that they have a blind spot, right, in their perceptual world. Something here happens also on the disability side in a very metaphorical way that Greenwald and Banaji were able to put together. And they build on many of the common illusions that we show in Psych 100. So in Psych 100, you probably have spent some time here on the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Again, it's interesting to look at any one of these and think of the fact that the eye receives, the brain registers, the mind interprets. To give us some of the illusions, like here in Mueller-Lyer, or here in the Ponzo illusion, where we often see a difference between the length of these yellow lines. Here in the Kanitsa triangle, many of us report seeing a brighter triangle floating above those Pac-Men in the background, when in fact there's no luminance difference there at all. We see some neon color spreading when in fact there isn't. Our mind is filling in all of these, despite the fact that the eye is not receiving any information about that. Here we see some color differences between the word international and the word color, and between the word vision and society. We take away that blinder, and we see that, in fact, just by toggling between these two, our brain is generating a lot of colors that are not physically there. Okay, so our mind does a lot of filling in. Here's another example that we typically refer to, not a chromatic color difference, but a lightness difference, where A and B are actually the same physical brightness, the same intensity, if you were to take out a light meter and measure it. But our brain does a lot of filling in here. It fills them with shapes. These are actually identically shaped objects, interestingly enough, but they don't feel that way somehow. Same thing with the Necker cube. So lots of examples here. We have something that's reaching the eye, that's the physical stimulus, but our brain does a lot of filling in. And that's what happens when we talk about some of the stereotypes that we have about people with disabilities. We have an unbewusster Schluss. We have a filling in. And this is pervasive in psychology. We see it in social psychology. We see it in sensation and perception. Many of us are familiar with this idea that the eye receives, the brain registers, and the mind interprets. We see it also in cognitive psychology. Here's a picture of Elizabeth Loftus, very famous cognitive psychologist, who talks about top-down influences on memory. There's a misinformation effect. There are other kinds of distortions that we can have in recovered memories, where we're recalling things that were not physically in the environment, very much like the illusions that we just saw a moment ago. All of these are instances of an unbewusster Schluss, another way of synthesizing these diverse topics of psychology and bringing disability into the picture. So to summarize for part 4, we can say that we can harken back to Kurt Kafka in the early years, and we can harken back also to Hermann von Helmholtz and bring up his topic of the unbewusster Schluss, or the unconscious inference, the unconscious conclusion that our brain does for us all the time. We're not aware of it. And this happens when we see example after example of the standard illusions that would fill an introductory psychology book, like the Mueller-Lyer illusion or the Ponzo illusion, some of the color illusions or illusions of shape and so forth. The unconscious inference characterizes much of perception. The eye receives, the brain registers, the mind interprets. And this very top-down influence plays an important role in much of psychology, whether we're talking about sensation and perception, or memory, or attitudes towards people with disabilities. So with that, I can see that we're nearing our time for questions. I thank you for staying with us through this presentation, and I'll try to get out of my slide share now and get back to the main screen and see if we'd like to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. That was fascinating, and I am a huge fan of that metaphor at the end, that so much of what we think about disability is us filling in what's not actually perceptually there, that so many of these ideas that we have about disability are illusions.
Yeah, they really are. And if I could just say, I want to again give credit to Doctors Banaji and Greenwald for making that metaphor. I sing their praises every time I get to share that, and I think the students see that connection as well. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So as we wait to see if people want to type in questions, we have one in the chat. Do you incorporate people with wheelchairs and mobility devices? Michaela, do you mean as for examples or as students? I just want to make sure, Dr. Matthews, well, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question also.
Well, oh, please go ahead. Yeah, both.
Both.
Okay. Well, yes. Okay. I try to keep my focus, given the nature of my course, on sensory disabilities. So I don't directly have assignments on that, but I will share that I have used other TED Talks where I've tried to incorporate people with a broader variety of disabilities. And I'm wishing that I could recall the entire title of one. It's something like this. I'm going to paraphrase the title of this. It's something like, "I'm Not Your Inspiration." And it is a woman who uses a wheelchair, and people frequently come up to her and say, "Oh, you're such an inspiration to me." And I'm sure that's very well intentioned. She takes umbrage to that, as she's been hearing that for decades, and it doesn't land well with her. And I've shown that one in my sensation and perception course, and it resonates with students. So I've been able to incorporate that one. But I have given the nature of the course, I tend to skew toward the perceptual rather than toward the motor.
Yes, I agree. Talia has commented in the notes that sounds like Dr. Stella Young, who
Yes, yeah,
is
that's
an
it. Yes,
Australian
yes.
activist or was an Australian activist before she passed away. And yes, that's a really good one. I like that you use that one. So I was thinking as an instructor, one, that your work is such a good demonstration of a bit of what we talked about, of what Dr. Olkin talked about, which is that disability in psychology should not be limited to clinical psychology. We should be addressing disability in all of these areas. So I thank you for your work in what might be one of the least obvious or overt areas of psychology, maybe one that people might struggle to connect to disability. So that's really cool. So along those lines, you talked about this sensation and perception class. If you were able to teach a further class on this, perhaps a senior seminar, what are some ways that you would want to expand on the ideas that you introduced to students, likely for the first time?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I want to reiterate the first part of your question there, and that is that I have very, very well-intentioned colleagues. When I told them I wanted to bring power and justice, disability issues to sensation and perception, they had the same reaction. Like this is probably the branch of psychology that's furthest away from that. How can that possibly work? And I tried to bridge that gap as best I could, and I'm grateful for their support these days. On your question, what would I do if I had an advanced seminar? There was a wonderful question at the end of the last session that spoke to a type of intersection, and I would like to develop the intersections a little bit more fully. So, and one of the ways I've started to do that in my class to talk about intersections between uh, say blindness and other forms of difference is I did go to look at the issue of blindness and extreme poverty. And I've been able to introduce a couple of videos and readings on a project called Project Prakash. Prakash is Prakash. It's the Sanskrit word for light. And there's a fellow from MIT who is very interested in bridging this gap. It turns out that in rural India, there's a tremendous challenge in getting people the health care that they need. And there's also a tremendous challenge with early cataracts. Some children are born with cataracts. Some children develop cataracts really quite completely very, very early in life. And it adversely affects their development in so many ways. You may or may not know the cataract surgery is actually, as surgeries go, it's still a surgery, but it's a relatively simple, a relatively low cost surgery. But people in certain regions of the world just don't get it. So on the question of the advanced seminar, I think I'd like to talk about intersections and something like a disability intersecting with the lack of availability for healthcare. And we could use something like Project Kosh, which is trying to raise awareness or bring light from the Sanskrit word to this problem of readily fixable issue that is encountering a social problem. And we're back to the biopsychosocial model again. I think that the same theme would work in the advanced seminar. So thank you for that question.
Yes. All right. Dr. Olkin has asked a question. Does this this work on the eye perceives, the brain registers, the mind interprets? Does this get used in forensic cases regarding the reliability of witnesses?
It does, yes, and that actually moves us a little bit out of sensation and perception, which is fine with me. We had Dr. A cognitive psychologist come in and talk to us about that, the idea about the unreliability of witnesses and so forth, and it's a bit of a challenge because they believe they believe themselves when they say, "I recall very directly that I saw this kind of a thing." And yet sometimes that can be directly contradicted by video footage and so forth. So this is something that does make its way into judicial cases. And sometimes cognitive psychologists are called in to talk about the unreliability of memory in that way.
Yeah, excellent. All right, and we do have sort of one last question or suggestion, perhaps for an example about using your topic about perception, about how we perceive person with a visible disability using a service animal versus a person with an invisible disability using a service animal, and how people will sort of accept the former, like, oh yes, that dog is of course needed, whereas for the latter, people might have some different ideas.
Yeah, yeah, that's an important point. And you might know, for those of us who have done the implicit attitude test, that actually a person who is depicted as having a helper animal is one of the ways of representing the person with disability. But yes, the idea that maybe some people are in greater need, or that the helper animal is more justified in some cases than others, is something else that people with disability have to deal with, and would make for a very rich essay. Is one of my essay assignments.
Absolutely. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. This has been such a fascinating and useful and applied addition to our conference. So we are now going to take another 5-minute break before we return for our intersectionality panel. So I'm going to put the timer back up, and we will see you all soon.